now it's time for our next panel. And our next panel is actually our accountability group. So these are the group that have been guiding us in the production of the conference and came up with the principles of participation for the conference. And they're going to be expanding on their thinking, their perspectives on why community-driven research and innovation matters to us. The panel is chaired by senior researcher at the Young Foundation, Amelia Clayton, who's also been the coordinator of the accountability group. And Amelia is not just a brilliant member of the Young Foundation team, but she's a representative of somebody who we took through our Kickstart programme sort of way back in the aftermath of lockdown. So you will remember, I'm sure, the Kickstart programme, which is really trying to encourage younger people into work in the aftermath of COVID. And the Young Foundation fought for about 8 months with DWP to recognise that research was a legitimate pathway for people into brilliant forms of employment and agency and change. And I was greatly appreciative when we were allowed to develop 3 cohorts of Kickstart young people that came through those doors, one of which was Amelia, who is still with us now. And so please come to the stage, Amelia Clayton and her panellists. So please welcome also Annette Andrew, Deborah Alera Luoka King, John Dolby and Julian Harrison. I leave you in Amelia's capable hands. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Helen. This has been such a wonderful experience, actually getting to work alongside these lovely people on stage and some who are not. But yeah, I started the Young Foundation as a peer researcher, and that has sort of put me in a position where I've not only worked as a peer researcher, but also supported them in my new role. And so I kind of get both sides of the coin of understanding the challenges, the wins, and the sort of learnings that you can gain throughout this process. And it sort of put me in a position where I understand where everyone from this accountability group has come from. And so that brings me to the accountability group. So it is made up of 7 individuals who have previously worked on participatory projects with the Young Foundation. So today we are joined with Julian Harrison, Annette Andrew, Deborah King and John Dolby. I will let them introduce themselves properly when it's their turn to speak. But yeah, we have in the past couple of weeks come together to reflect deeply on what good community research can actually look like and what it should look like. From these sort of discussions, we actually create a set of principles that you should hopefully be familiar with. If not, please look on the Young Foundation website where we do have them. These principles are not only set up to put us in the best position today to come together, but also they're a representation of a bigger vision, one where research is a lot more inclusive, more empowering, a lot more community driven, and grounded in lived reality and experience. And they really embody this idea of nothing about us without us. This session is a chance for us to explore this vision. It's a safe space for all of our accountability group to reflect and share their thoughts on why community-driven research should be a priority in the design and development of research projects. And hopefully it will offer inspiration and a thoughtful lead into this afternoon's sessions where hopefully these conversations will continue to come up. But yeah, on that note, I will start by asking questions. So, thinking about community research and the sort of wins through the process and the learnings, how is it that you would make research impactful for community members?
Thanks, Amelia. Hi, everyone. I'm John Dolby. I currently work at Wakefield Council in the public health team, but have been in contact with the Young Foundation as a participant in Ben's microplastic study that we heard about earlier. So it's one of my bedrooms that he was referring with the high amount of microplastics in, and I'll touch on that later. I did have an answer to my question prepared, but the excellent panel this morning have done a great job at answering everything through their really well designed, community engaged processes. So instead, I'm going to reflect a little over lunchtime on the seed. So Pandora's Oriental seed. When you participate in research, it can plant a seed within you. If the conditions are right, it will grow and it will change into something. That could be a meaningful change that ripples through communities. It can be something that you make a change yourself within your own circumstances. But in order to do that, it needs to have the space and the conditions in which to grow. Please excuse me whilst I just find my notes that I had to quickly scribble at lunch. I think I've deleted them by accident, so just let me go into the archived ones. So it needs time, space, support and care, then the change can become possible. But my concern is when you participate in research, you take on new knowledge, you learn new things, you have to be able to act on what you've found and discovered. So when I was a participant in Ben's microplastic study, it was one of my bedrooms he was talking about, as I mentioned, and the research was designed so well, talking about how barriers are removed, that my then 5 and 7-year-old children led the research. I applied to do it. They carried out the research. They put the petri dish in the bedroom. They put the microscope on my phone and did the things there. So that's when design and co-design is done right, and it was obvious that it had come through the community first, and those really engaged people. But what landed with me is that we were able to replace my wife's awful dressing gown. That was the obvious source of microplastic. Horrible spotted dressing gown. And since then, we've replaced our mattress and we've replaced our duvet. And that's because of my privilege. We were in a space where we were able to afford to do those things. And what about those participants in the study that weren't able to make those changes? They had that knowledge that microplastic is prevalent everywhere, even in your bedroom, your safe space where you sleep. So what does research need to do in order to remove that inequity that it could potentially create? And that's no reflection on Ben. You know, it was a really well-designed project, but how do we avoid that? And this is why Hannah's example particularly stuck with me when she spoke about what it looks like to properly resource a community and those participants, that safe space, those warm meals, the childcare, the ability for people to really partake in the research as full participants rather than the other guises and the other lenses that they have. And it also led me to question, is there a potential inequity between the lived experience community-based research and the more science-based research, when perhaps those softer impacts are not really considered by funders and there's not really space for them within it? So how do you make research impactful for community members? You design for action, not just involvement. You make space for people to act on what they've learned right away, not just reflect on it or sit with it. You recognise that equity is not just about who gets to take part, it should also be about who is supported to respond. And you resource communities in a way that allows them to not just contribute, but to lead. Because when a project moves from planting a seed to nurturing real lasting change, the kind that starts in a single household, ripples out through neighbours and community and beyond, that's when a real difference can be made. And finally, I'd like to shout out to the Young Foundation and to Amelia and Alice and to Sian, because the values that we heard this morning and the values that I've just talked about have been present throughout our whole experience, I think speaking for all of us on the accountability group. So thank you to you, and thank you.
I promise I did not tell him to say that. But honestly, thank you so much. And I just echoing that point, it would not have been possible without having the space to talk through them, because as much as we had those ideas to begin with, it's a co-production process, and none of those values would have shone through as brightly if you hadn't have called us out on certain things and said, oh, that don't quite work. You know, we needed that. And I think that's where this type of work is really important. And I think your analogy of the ripple there at the end, I think it's really important to just acknowledge that it may just start in one household, but if you set the conditions right, it can spread outwards. And, you know, that lived experience is the sort of key point there, which actually brings us on to the next question. So with that idea of lived experience in mind, how is it that you involve that in the design of projects from the get-go?
Thank you, Amelia. Once again, I'm Deborah Lero, One Local King. I'm proud of those names. I'm proudly Nigerian, and I'm happy to meet everyone here today. He has actually spoken about lived experience using his family. It shows that it's family oriented. John is somebody that used this research to actually change his wife's dressing horrible, according to him, dressing gown. So let's pick it up from there. Looking at that, would you say that we can do without lived experience in research? I would love a response, people. And I would like you to take it as a rhetorical question. Do you think lived experience is inevitable? And the final rhetorical question I will go back to towards the end is, how important do you think lived experience would go in creating a design for research? Now, I want in this room, you can shout it, right? I would appreciate that. Can people just tell me, just in one word, what you call lived experience? What comes to mind? Anywhere, from my left, from my right, anywhere, lived experience. What comes to mind first? Personal. Thank you. Pardon me? Embodied. Lovely. Story. Testimony. Honesty. Representation. Thank you very much. I know everyone sitting here has something to say about lived experience, but all what you mentioned actually goes with what I brought here for you. And the first thing I looked at in saying what lived experiences, I refer them to direct first-hand information, knowledge, personal perspective. Remember someone shouted personal? Another person said emotions. I also came here to tell you that it has to do with emotions, valuable expertise, informing research policy. Also, participatory approach is needed, whereby people need to make use of their voice. Deborah stands for the voiceless. I've recently been through some mental health issues from end of last year up until April. I had to travel back to Nigeria like twice. And here I am today because research gave me my confidence back. I'm saying this out of something passionate. I'm actually passionate about. That will lead me to the question for today. I did a research with Young Foundation about West Midlands inclusive growth. And that research brought me to today because they saw something. I went further, I embedded lived experience in it. I used a diverse group. I used different demographic, meaning different ages. Remember, we said we are not using ambiguous words here today. So I'm going to be breaking it down. I made use of peer research. And those ideas they shared their story. Somebody mentioned story at the back, remember? And they shared personal, emotional things. They learned from me, I learned from them. I went further, I concluded a research in April 2025, April 9th in Birmingham, with another research company, permit me to say BVSC, they usually collaborate with the Young Foundation. And I talked about the barrier of effective communication in English language during childbirth between patients who speak English language as their second language and health workers in Birmingham hospitals. That particular research brought out a lot. We just did a poster. I made use of the methodology that is formal, informal, and semi-formal. I also went further to talk about using media. I love pictures, I love videos, and I use it to share my story. Other people's story as well. And that is applicable to lived experience. You do not need to have those degrees, the master's degrees, undergraduate, PhD degrees before you can apply lived experience to co-creating your design project. Like he mentioned, it's 2 children, which I know they're actually in primary or secondary?
Primary. Yeah.
Primary. They actually made a research. So we do not need to be so, up there. We can pick from the little to the biggest. We start As a teacher, I start from the very little and simple things to the complex, and understanding and effective communication takes place. I'll move ahead to making you know some key points. They are just 5, and I'll be very brief with them. The very first one is, if you want to have lived experience being co-designed into your project, you need to take note of co-creation and consultation. You must be actively involved with people with direct experience shaping goals, because their voice matters. And when you say that you want your research to be heard, you need to get involved. That community-led, driven research starts with you and I today. And the second one I will take note of, so we can create solutions and suggest them to the people, is user-centered research. User-centered research has to do with you conducting that community-led research using qualitative research method. How can that be possible? I believe that you using a qualitative, it could be formal, it could be informal, it could be semi-formal, through interviews, through photo elicitation, through expanding, through your stories, through personal ideas, learning from one another, through peer research, through this particular group. We take it up from there, and we could create solutions. I'll move on to the next one, which is that diverse representation. How do you want to present diversity? We talk about diversity, inclusiveness in our different places of work. To create that community-led research, applying the life experience, I said mine. I was in the labor room. I saw another person that couldn't speak English, and that was what brought about my barrier to effective communication in childbirth, basically. So that is a typical example of accepting people the way they are. The diverse community is needed. The UK is actually a multicultural society. I'm from Wolverhampton, and I'm in an inclusive church, St. Charles and St. Mark, Wolverhampton, and we accept people the way they are. That is how we can actually get the best out of our participants in research. If you don't let them come with the way they are, you don't want to be original or genuine about your research. The second to the last one is feedback loops. Those feedback, they are very important. It actually helps us to get that refined project. Take them back. Those outcomes are very important from the people that actually did the research. Not you hiding or saying you want to go to the council or let them change it. Let us be original in our research when making them. And it goes a long way. And I will say that the last one here for my 5 points is equitable decision making. Remember at the beginning, we keep looking at the equity, equity, equity. So when you are making that decision, that needs to stand out. With lived research, we need our participants to be empowered. We need to know that we must commend their outcomes as well. Also looking into that, we would also look at the conclusive part that I actually have here for you. I want you all to join me. Applying lived research in every research project you find yourself in, no matter the sector. The key thing I picked out from here is, it is a crucial component that community research provides valuable knowledge, perspectives, and insights that are essential for understanding and addressing community issues from the grassroots. So join me today, and let's push boundaries where you think you can never get to with your research project today. And it begins with you and I. Thank you. And thank you, Young Foundation, for the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah. I think you raised a lot of good points there about equity there. And, you know, lived experience is so vital to this work. So including it at all aspects, I think, yeah, 100%. And thinking about lived experience, with that comes the idea of inclusivity. And how is it that you actually set up a project from the start with the idea of inclusivity in mind? So Annette, do you want to
So, hi, my name's Nat Andrew, and my involvement with the Young Foundation was with Net Zero project that was in one of the local boroughs. And we carried out 3 workshops as a peer researcher. It was extremely interesting, and it was an honor to be part of that project because it was lived experience and it was qualitative research. For what I learned from that was to when you're actually conducting a piece of research, it's imperative to work from the ground up. You have your research ideas and you need to actually clarify whether they're valid and what the impact will be initially before you actually go forth with that piece of research would be, I mean, this is what was coming forth from the people. You have a rich foundation to work from. So working from focus groups, working with leaders in the community and establishments that are already in place, they already have the connection with the people who will be able to work with you because they trust the organizations that they're with already. When you're talking about communication, communication needs to be clear. It needs to be simple. And if English is not the first language, then just get interpreters in, get people who speak sign language, anything that you can do to include everybody in that form of research that you want to conduct. People were feeling, how should I say, they were feeling a little bit anxious about whether their lived experience would be valid. And that came through with regards to them communicating. I'm a little bit deaf. I don't know whether or not I'll be able to hear. Will they provide a signer for me? You know, those sorts of things. I'm in a wheelchair. Will they be accessible? I don't have internet at home, or I'm not savvy with internet access. How can I communicate? How are they going to participate, get me to participate in this piece of research? I have a lot to offer. I have a lot to say. So how are they going to work with me on that? There's a lot of information that the people have that they would love to be to share in the to build their community, to build on policies and procedures that people are putting in place for them in their communities, and they want to be part of that, but they just need to be included. They need to have their differences acknowledged in the way that they can participate. It's really important. Face-to-face is always key. Face-to-face is the best form of communication that came forth. And even providing when you're doing, for example, workshops in the community, the one that I participated in, we had workshops that included childcare so that people with children could also participate and they were not excluded. We had people who had mobility difficulties, people who had hearing impairments, and it was imperative. One had, I mean, some people have invisible disabilities, and in this particular incident, the gentleman had a hearing impairment on one side, and the way that he was seated, he could not hear the instructions that were given for the workshop. When the workshop was taking place, I observed that he was sitting by himself and he was not participating. So I went up to him and I spoke to him and I said to him, you know, can I explain anything to you? Is there anything that you need to know? Or can I help in any way? And he said quietly, and he looked around the table and he said, I've got a hearing impairment. I didn't hear what they asked me to do. So I went immediately to the other side of him and explained everything to him. And he had lived in the borough for 50 years. Can you imagine how much rich data this man had in able to contribute? And if he had just been left to his own devices or had been given something to do digitally, he would not have been able to participate. So I ask you to think openly with an open mind when you're thinking about conducting a piece of research. Please make sure it includes everybody.
Thank you for that. And I think your examples there are so key to consider, like little things like just standing on a different side, acknowledging that, you know, we may have to adapt minor things for people, but that would then open up their inclusion. These need to be core to what we're doing. So thank you for those examples. And I think that idea of just, you know, approaching this with that kind of genuine consideration is really important, and sort of brings us on to our final discussion of this session, which is thinking about the idea of genuine. What is it that actually means within the context of community research? And Julian.
Wow, I don't quite know how to follow three superb colleagues who've articulated lots of things that are certainly in my heart and in my head. Just to tell you a little bit about myself, my name's Julian. I have a lived experience, I have a lifelong lived experience of living with mental illness. I have depression, I have OCD, I have anxiety disorder, and I'm also autistic. And my mood has dipped quite markedly this week. Not I hasten to add, the thought of being in front of you wonderful people today. But as you might imagine, an autistic person with anxiety disorder, this is perhaps the natural domain that you would choose to find yourself in on an afternoon. But it is nice to speak to you. And I guess that it needs unpicking a little bit, this notion of what's genuine. And I guess over the years, I've been involved in lots of what you might call, I don't know whether this is the right term, traditional research that's involved being led by somebody else, being led by an academic, being led by a service, and so on and so forth. And I've had some great experiences in that. It has to be said. But I've also had some really bad ones, and I guess it makes you begin to question those sort of experiences where it's almost as if people think they're doing me a favour by involving me. That actually we've got a place at the table now. We want to hear what you've got to say, but in quite a controlled fashion, quite a determined fashion. You don't set the agenda, you're asked to commentate on it, you're asked particular questions, you give a particular perspective. And this, you might enter research for the purposes of trying to make a difference. Certainly why I do it, to try and make a difference, not just to me, but to those people, certainly in lived experience with mental illness and autism, who are like me and maybe who are less confident and are less able to actually come through the door to be at that table. And so you find yourself in this type of situation where you're almost asked to sort of validate or verify or confirm someone else's assertions, someone else's conclusions, someone else's recommendations, without you actually being asked to set the question that started it all off. And living with mental illness, and for those of you that do this, and autism as well, it's challenging. It's not pleasant at times. It has its moments, it has its good moments, it has its bad moments, but often you find when you're in a situation and you've been motivated enough to want to take part in something, when someone else takes away that opportunity of empowerment that you thought you had, it's like a massive double whammy. You get very, very disheartened, you get very disillusioned, you feel disenfranchised, you feel hesitant to want to come back. Because you think, oh, I'm not going to go through that again. I've told you all this. I've opened my soul to you to tell you about all these things. And actually, you were always going to write this particular conclusion. I'm sure, and they don't do it deliberately. Of course, they don't do it deliberately. But indirectly, maybe the problem is that the research was set to fail right at the start. And it's set to fail because it didn't get me in right at the start. It didn't get us round the table initially, not just to say, right, these are the questions we're going to ask, this is what we're going to focus on, these are the methods we're going to do it, but actually to ask us, what do you think we should do? Who do you think we should involve? Where should we involve them? How should we involve them? The need to work flexibly, within the environment. We've heard Annette talk about inclusivity. All that is really, really key, and everything that people have said is really key. So when you get that opportunity to do that, it does make a difference. Now, I think, and I don't know what my colleagues think about this, but I think things are changing. I think they're changing very slowly in the realm of not not of citizens science research, I guess, but in that traditional method. And I think one of they're changing slowly in the direction of giving me a little bit more power, and of letting me talk as I want to talk, not as how they want me to talk. I get the feeling things are changing, and one of the reasons why I think they are changing is because of citizen science. This, you mentioned it, Amelia, nothing about us without us. It's a classic mantle. You hear people saying these words. You hear them saying things about good co-production, about effective engagement, participation, involvement. Sometimes I don't know what those words mean because the reality does not mix in my head with what I see at a grounded level. But I think things are changing. The very thought that I would be asked not just to take part in something like this today, but to shape it 5-10 years ago, I'd have thought, are you serious? Is this a leg pull? But no, we even the shape of what we're doing here, the four of us in front of Amelia. Amelia asked us, how do you want to do it? We've got a certain amount of time. How do you want to do it? Now that is like music to your ears, really, and the ability to be able to shape the principles of participation and all the stuff that's gone into the nature of this conference and this session today, I think shows us that the direction is quite clear, but we have to allow people in. We have to allow people to speak their minds. We have to give people the opportunity, if they can't speak, to use alternative ways of speaking, the written word, doing things behind the scenes maybe, video stuff beforehand, all those things that we need to do to make sure that accessibility equals inclusivity. We have to do those things, not as a separate thing, not as an isolated phenomenon, but as part of the routine of doing research per se. And once we've done that, we will have cracked it.
Just if I could respond really quickly, the examples we heard this morning, particularly Hannah's example, showed how when research is done in an exploitative way to communities, the impact is negatively widespread, whereas if it's done in an accessible, inclusive way that's cognizant of the lived experience and the potential, then the ripples will grow.
Thank you. And thank you all for your really thoughtful input today. I think it's been really interesting to sort of reflect on the Menti earlier and how that's come up quite strongly here, like the ideas of equity, inclusion, thinking about who you are at the time of the research and taking people as they are, adapting to their needs. I think these are things which this type of research is really useful for, because it probably is one of the most flexible for that. But yeah, I just want to say a huge thank you to our panel. I think you've all been absolutely fantastic, and working with you has been a delight. And hopefully that this has left you with some food for thought for our afternoon sessions. And hopefully you have taken from this some really interesting input. But yeah, thank you all so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.